Welcome to this analysis video detailing a lot of the wonderful, wonderful interior work that's being concepted now by CIG for the 4.0 patch coming in the future. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. If you are a long-term subscriber, thank you for sticking around. Now, there's a lot of good information here that is detailing how these interiors are going to look, and a lot of the underlying technology is in the 3.18 patch cycle and beyond, all the way up to 4.0, where it's going to be realized into where these cities, planetary landing locations / cities, if you will, are going to be going. And there's a lot to unpack here. So let's, without further ado, let a lead concept artist explain his vision for 4.0.
Let's start with rooftops. Now, up until now, we've largely designed our cityscapes to be more of a backdrop to the landing zone. We have the social space generally in the middle, and then the cityscape goes around it. And they've been designed to give the best composition, to be interesting to fly around. But we've not really thought about designing these buildings from the inside out. So what we're looking at here is some potential concepts for what could be interesting landing spaces that drives the architecture of the building. With landing pads, it doesn't necessarily need to be on the top of the building. It could be, halfway down or lower. So imagine, you're in the lower parts of the city, and then we'd open up these additional play spaces. And as you can see here, it's not just the landing pad, it's the gameplay space that goes along with it too. Now, it doesn't necessarily need to be a single building. Imagine there is a network hub that services a few different buildings. So what we're looking at here is maybe like a transit hub where the player could land, get on some transit, and then that would lead to some buildings.
So the first thing I thought of when Ian Leyland brought out his whole vision for 4.0's interior structures was Hurston Dynamics Tower and the ArcCorp Tower in the center of both of those planetary landing locations as status symbols. And the top of those buildings, the Million Mile High Club in the case of ArcCorp, and in the case of Hurston Dynamics, the Hurston Dynamics Tower being this monolith that's overwhelming the entire city. Those landing locations will be ultra premium. Now, on the flip side of that, as was hinted here by Leyland, is the idea of having landing locations that are lower on the towers and also in these transit hubs that may be shared amongst multiple buildings, i.e. not as luxurious, more of a common standard or a middle class or whatever you want to call these different strata of the different societies that are there. Remember, many different planets have different perspectives on how their societies are arranged, whether it's dense residential or spread out residential, and even floating platforms that have completely different cultures on each one of them, like in Horizon. I think that there's a lot of interesting places to explore here, and it is prime territory to mold these buildings around the idea that there is a lot of flight involved. After all, we are mostly pilots in this verse. Very few people don't want to fly a spaceship. And being able to treat the flying approaches just as important as the mass transit capabilities is a great direction to go for the future of the game. It also opens up a lot of gameplay opportunities that you're going to see further along in this video we're going to take a look at. So just some really cool stuff here. I'm very excited, and I'm glad to see that there's a little bit of variety in these landing locations, and it also fills in a lot of gaps. So when you're talking about hundreds of players possibly being in the same area, how they're all going to be there, how there's a variety, and it fits all the different demographics of the game.
Okay, so maintenance spaces. So these could be really interesting in terms of player interaction. They could be dealing with the power or the maintenance of the building. And then also you could have technical spaces. So these would be more for technicians. It could deal with the data or the communications. And what we're looking at here is potential some, gameplay puzzles where the player has to work their way inside the main operation booth.
What is described here has already been hinted at in the past when New Babbage came out. The idea of having living cities that have missions within structures to be able to find. In a previous CitizenCon, they showed off this wonderful medical research facility. You had to get inside and hack the system and get all the information about microtech and then try to sneak your way back out. And then you had to put on a suit to protect yourself from the hazards of the snow and the blizzard that was happening outside. This is an example of how these buildings will have missions built in, and perhaps places players can explore in their downtime to check out. But either way, one of the things I do like about this is it's things that you can explore while you're waiting for, let's say, your buddies to set up their multi-crew ship, and you're waiting to crew that ship. Or maybe you're meeting up with some org mates at the local bar in a little bit, and they're taking their sweet time to log in and get set up and whatever else. You have something to do. You can run missions, make some cred, maybe go around and explore different locations that you're not used to finding, or it could be a brand new experience for you. I think that's one of the cooler things of this. I think of MMORPGs, dare I say it, in different categories where they have mini missions that are inside the main cities. And I think of RuneScape and Varrock and such, where you can get your feet wet into different missions and explore and fully really kind of feel like you're part of the city. And nobody says the missions can't have a background in the storyline and really let you see some of the maybe the good and bad of the corporations that are involved in the game. And I think that would be really interesting. I also think it would be really cool to have workspaces for specialist gameplay, like science research and such, or data runners can check their stuff on these commercial locations if they manage to get inside these structures, or pay extra as part of their rental to get that going.
So moving on to residential. So there's a huge amount of potential here. What we wanted to do with residential is two things. One, explore investigating the potential player housing. So with that, we want to be able to create a variety of interior layouts. And also we want to explore a variety of architectural styles. So when we're looking at potential housing layouts, we wanted something fairly modular in a way in which we could create a variety of combinations. So whether it's living spaces or habitation spaces or social spaces. And also here we're looking at, we want the players to eventually be able to populate the player-owned habitation. So you see here like a first indication of how, the sort of dressing styles that you'd be able to do. Outside of something that's fairly utilitarian, we also want to do something that could be fairly high-end. So here we're just exploring some ideas about what a space could feel like on a different architectural style, and more generous windows, interior spaces dedicated to more than just habitation. And these would be focused on other landing zones. So imagine you come across these in Area 18, or it could be when we come to Terra. And also, like I said, it could be informing future player-owned habitation architectural sets.
When I see these designs, my heart goes back to the hangar module many years ago, where we could spawn in Arrowview Hangar, Revel in New York Hangar were two of my favorites out of the four. And I think of the beautiful lines of Revel in New York. It was almost too clean. It was too pearly white, off-white. It was too Apple Story, I guess, but I still enjoyed the space. The clean, light-colored woods that were inside that space, and the luxurious feel of a hangar. It basically a building of utility that had these capabilities. And one of the cool things about those locations was there was these blue marks on the ground and on the walls that allowed you to place your purchases off the Voyager Direct, where you could use a UEC to purchase different things on the website for $1 or $2 if you didn't want to get them in Arena Commander, etc. And you could put them up on the walls, posters, towel rack of all things, a cot, a workbench, which was promised to have capabilities. I'm holding you to that, CIG, and for tuning modules on your ships and such. So there was things of decoration, there was things of utility, there was things that actually made you comfortable in these spaces. And what I see here is a few hints of that earlier design of the hangar module, and even the industrial style hangar had its place. And so far in this video, we've seen that the renders of more of the fancy areas, maybe the Revel in York, if you will, and maybe a little bit of the hint of the Arrowview business style designs, but not necessarily more of what the working guy wants, or maybe somebody who wants to really, do racing and haul across these modules that need to get fixed up and put back into service for the next race. It's gonna and doesn't want to scuff up a floor that looks like it's too pristine. So I'm interested in maybe some more utility-minded areas in these locations, as I hinted in the previous analysis section on this video. Um, Maybe those areas could be in the commercial sections of the building. So you live in these nicer areas, but then you don your jumpsuit, you go over to the industrial areas or the science areas, and you do your different roles on things that you've found, maybe on architectural sites around the space, around the verse, and science type things like we mentioned already that you've researched that you need to find more information on before you head out to go maybe follow a new lead. And of course, data running. Having large comms arrays on these massive skyscrapers has to have more capabilities than a small ship's sensor package. Uh, and computing power, to say the least. One of the things in this game that they've always emphasized is the computing power of these ships is rather small. I'd imagine that a large city's centralized data network and a huge building like this must have better infrastructure than a ship, unless we're talking about a capital ship or something. So, just some food for thought. I'm curious to see where they go with the actual utility of these areas, but I'm very excited to see the spaces. Even just seeing residential spaces with staircases and actual second floors and stuff is very exciting to me. And we'll see more of that premium aspect in some of these other parts coming up right after this. But it's something to really think about, the filling of players in the space. I think this is also a good time for CIG to maybe drop some hints about if subscribers, concierge, maybe just even long-term backers could have maybe some little nods to them. Maybe just a slightly, bigger window area. Or if that's not good, maybe just a plaque to put on the wall or something. I think that would be smart for CIG to pull. And of course, for upcoming events, little things that you can stock your new play space with. Your residential area can become more personalized and more yours.
So outside of residential, we're moving into the commercial area. So what this means is it means we can look at areas that are more gameplay focused outside of player habitation. So when we're talking about these could be office blocks, these could be corporate owned. Inside here, there could be corporate wings, there could be manufacturing, there could be office spaces. And what we try to think about with these, it's more than just a flat room. There should be advanced reversal, it should be multi-tiered.
So this is the biggest hint that they have player support in this video for different professions. And I like to see this, but Leyland used the term corporation wing, not org wing. So I feel that the first iterations of this are going to be, it's owned by the company that owns the city or owns a large piece of where the building you're at. Not necessarily that an org can lease out that office or lease out that manufacturing space. Maybe you can lease time there, but the company on the wall and the sharing of the space suggests to me at best that players will have some support for their professions, but it won't necessarily be like an org can book office 25 on this building is that organization's office. So I'm interested to see how they handle that. I have a sneaking feeling that it's going to be an NPC run corporation, one of the many we have in the game so far, probably one of the 4 big ones, for example, at first. And they will own it. And I hope that at the very least that players will be able to do different non-combat professions in these locations. And on the flip side of that, I do agree that missions involving combat, sneaking, or just corporate espionage in general, or etc., would be very interesting at these locations. Once again, set dressed locations that don't impact other players, etc., would be very welcome. And I think that this is a good example of how these large structures are going to be almost a mini city in themselves. And I mean, they're going to have everything. I think the next section is entertainment areas like bars and restaurants. So let's jump right into that.
So outside of the commercial offices, we've also got like restaurants and bars. So what we're looking at here is a pretty cool skyline bar in Lowville. That could be fun. But also in restaurants, Chris always described the idea of really high-end restaurants in the game where you can get access to food choices that isn't available anywhere else. So right at the foot of the building, we're going to start talking about the lobby. So as I said before, these are going to be access points to the player, but also we can do more than just a standard foyer that we're seeing in the game right now. So this sort of space we're seeing here is, imagine there's an underground transit network, and that transit station feeds a network of building lobbies. So these could be social spaces, these could be really good combat spaces. They could have access to mini restaurants or bars or facilities. And we're just showing that in a variety of art styles. So one's a fairly low end, one could be fairly high end, but the infrastructure is the same.
We had a little bit to unpack here. So you had the description of locations that are one of a kind that you can only experience in different planetary landing locations. These high-end restaurants, for example, that were cited by Leyland, by Chris Roberts' guidance. Now, let's talk a little bit about the more, I guess, pressing part of that is the tie-in of these multi-tier lobby areas that have support services for the rest of the building. You saw images of cafes and images of transit locations, but I would say that there's probably going to be a lot of other locations there that would be very interesting to players. For starters, I would like to see armor repair locations and maybe an armorer that can work on your weapons and such. Take some of that stuff that you can only get in certain locations and put it in the building. One of the best examples I can think of is if they have a luxury area within Lorville that you can actually purchase weapons and have them worked on by an armorer and purchase upgrades and everything else, and players can upgrade them there. That would be fascinating because currently you cannot get weapons on Lorville because the policy of Hurston Dynamics is that their workers are not allowed to have access to those type of things. However, it would be very interesting to find out, well, there needs to be these other rich families and these other people that are off-worlders, and as long as you're living in this location, you're considered an off-worlder. You're not working for HD. You're more of a military contractor. They have to expect you to be able to maintain your gear, your armor, your weapons, etc. So I would be interested to see little changes like that, nuances. And that brought up, when I started thinking about it, that brought up like a whole nother bevy of thoughts. Players could suddenly have a new identity just based on where they live. If you live in this tower that's more combat oriented or this tower that's more indie oriented, suddenly you would have this whole identity around you. You run into other players that have the same mindset. You have the same thoughts. Maybe landing locations that can accommodate 50 prospectors better than they can accommodate combat vessels that might be a bit larger or smaller. Hauling locations that maybe are on the outskirts of town and more accommodate the needs of a large ship that needs, like a hauler, that needs a lot of fuel and cargo resources over maybe smaller loads, for example. Oh, I'll just bring it back to where I live and operate out of. And my maybe hopefully in the future office is for my organization. They got me saying it now. So I think there would be some really interesting things here where these towers are more like cultural beacons and identities for these players. And once again, meeting like-minded players, having those environments that are very comfortable for what the play style the player wants.
So as we're exploring art style opportunities, this then drives where it would be appropriate. So some would be more appropriate in somewhere like Area 18, some would be more appropriate in somewhere like Horizon, and obviously some would be more appropriate for future landing zones like Odessa or Prime.
The last words out of Leyland's mouth are the reason that I made this video. It gave me the final little kick to make this video. So he describes Prime and Odessa, and I have to tell you that these locations are unique because, first of all, they're not in the game yet, and they are truly different places than what we're used to. So let's start with Odessa. Very fascinating place for explorers like myself and like Ash and some other fine folks that listen to these discussions and watch these videos. Odessa is a former shipbuilding city before the UEE abandoned it and abandoned the overall system of Magnus. and it's been said that it was the edge of civilization in the past. The exact words was the edge of the unknown by the Newcastle Tourism Board. And Odessa is large amounts of abandoned and empty warehouses that have been slowly been revitalized in recent years by Drake. Drake Interplanetary has been a major push for Odessa. A lot of Drake's ships really emulate well this idea of rugged aesthetic and utility above all else, and trying to make do with what you have. Magnus 2, the planet that Odessa is on, is a it is a terraform system. So let's clear this up right now. So it is the best of the terraformed planets in that system. However, the planet Berea, which is also Magnus 2, has a very harsh climate, and it has, once again, dozens and dozens of abandoned UEE naval facilities that are falling apart, that the parts of this city of Odessa have basically been made out of. Basically, they've been scrapping all these different parts and pulled them into makeshift settlements all around that area that the city of Odessa has been slowly been turned into. And it's kind of interesting to me that these old military yards and construction facilities for the UEE Navy have now been churning out cutlasses and caterpillars. So it's a pretty interesting place. In fact, one of the things they have is squatters' rights issues, where smaller fledgling corporations and people have basically taken over entire industrial facilities and tried to claim them as their own. And Drake is basically just the biggest power in that area. It's like this no man's land, so to speak, of a city. So Berea is going to be a very fascinating place. We only have a couple pictures of Berea. I have one of the pictures from an early Galactic Guide lore post back in 2014 up on the page now. But I suspect as it gets closer to even having the Magnus system in testing, let alone in game and even in the PTU or something where we can actually get to it, there's going to be a lot more information fleshing this out, Galactopedia articles on every single planet in it, and the system itself, and the stories of how the system fell apart in the beginning and how it's being revitalized in the future. But it is an interesting system. It's a young system, too, starting in 2499, and then the military commission closed terraforming starting in 2533. So we're not talking about a massive amount of time like many of the other systems in the game that are just firmly established in recent lore. So sorry to lure out on you for a moment, but I just wanted to fill that in as a gap that I think many people are probably, if they either let that little mention by the lead artist fly by, or they might have gone, what is that? I wonder what's going on with it. So the other planetary landing location that we want to talk about is Prime. Prime is a city on Terra. And we know a little bit more about Prime than Odessa, but without glorying out on you again, Prime is basically compared to the largest cities that are on Sol. They're in the system of Sol, and the planet that we call today. It is a habitable location. It is the capital city of Terra, and it is a powerhouse in itself. Prime is basically like the new guard. It's supposed to be the sparkling downtown, lower residential areas, known as the blocks. There's actually a few different lore posts that are covering in and around Prime, and it's pretty interesting to me that some of the architecture over there is Shian in nature, and they have Fashion Week in this city. So it's a very, very different vibe than we've had in the past in other interesting places. You know, I think we are a little spoiled in Stanton because we have 4 mega planetary landing locations. Yes, some could use a pass and polish and such, but when they are fully realized, they are going to be very impressive. But many systems in the game only have one major location, if that, that is worth really noting as a major planetary landing location slash capital city, if you will, of that location, or the whole system. So it's an interesting place. And once again, as we get closer to Prime becoming a real place that you can visit, you can bet that there'll be even more wonderful, wonderful lore posts about it, more discussions, more concept art, more gameplay discussions about how it's going to feel to be there. And I think Prime is an excellent example of where these buildings are going to thrive. Places with a ton of infrastructure in a capital city that's one of the jewels of the UEE is going to be a wonderful place to live and have every single amenity imaginable. Whereas Odessa is a place that would test a large skyscraper out of existence, and makes me wonder exactly how it's going to be changed or hybridized, or are you going to walk around with holes in the walls? I think of Grim Hex, where some of the walkways have 0G because literally the systems have failed, and you can't walk around without a spacesuit on and be willing to EVA across some of the broke out areas, or the medical facilities that leave a lot to be desired with plastic on the walls at Grim Hex. I think of these locations as more a tiny version of what we can expect in Odessa on a grand scale. And honestly, I find both exciting. I mentioned before the exploration aspect of an area like Odessa probably has a lot of wonderful things to find in those abandoned buildings, and stories of the UEE Navy's earlier days really would fascinate me. And even if that's just a relatively low per UEC per hour way to make cred, I think it would be a fun way to make some money exploring the verse, literally exploring abandoned military bases, viewing the places where they build cutlasses and cats and such, hanging out in a dive bar, and maybe hopefully not having to throw a punch. It'd be a really fun time though, and I think that's once again, different times, different flows, keeps me interested in the game by having so many various places to hang out. But I probably wouldn't live there 24/7. I think that's not my vibe. But if that's your go, hey, now you know a little bit more about the verse if you haven't already, and Odessa is surely going to be a wonderful place to live if that's your speed.
Now, finally, we're going to talk about the underground. Now, this is, I think, one of the coolest spaces. So rather than just focusing on the positive axis of the building, we're going to look at the underground. Now, what this does, it means we can access a whole area of play space that doesn't need to be contained inside the building. So within the lobby, we want the player to start to traverse down into these spaces, and these could be underground transit networks. They could be abandoned underground transit networks. This then could drive potential racing opportunities. So when we was doing this, we thought, oh, it'd be really cool. Like, what would it look like if there's an underground street race going on there? Also, there could be traversal opportunities. Like I said before, if the player wanted to go into one building, down, and then through, and then up into another building, what would that traversal network be like? Especially if we're thinking about if it's an older part of the underground of a city, maybe it's less used, people have built up. That would instantly inspire a whole bunch of traversal and investigation missions there. Or maybe there's an old aqueduct or an old infrastructure underground. This could be perfect for underground street racing or other racing opportunities. So this ties into a much larger initiative. So we're seeing it a little bit now with the redo of Lowville. That's turning into a much bigger cityscape. And what that means is every city in the game is ready for these building interior spaces. Now, one thing to note is the cityscapes are probably going to change a little bit. Just from an initial investigation, we found our buildings are quite small. So expect to see the skylines go through a period of transition, but that's cool because that means we're designing the inside of the buildings and then we'll redo the architecture to fit to that. So I think it's going to be super positive for the game. So just in case we was thinking it's all just blue sky concept, actually we're going to start full production on these spaces right at the end of this
Going
quarter.
into production now, and in fact, by the time this airs, we'll already have started. And that the journey to 4.0 may have Pyro at its center, but it will still continue to evolve all aspects of StarCitizen and the existing persistent universe around it.
As Jared pointed out, these things do not stop them from working on Pyro. They do not stop them from working on other factors of 4.0. And honestly, it is interesting that the game is able to have every large planetary landing location, i.e. mostly cities, covered in this design from the ground up to implement this new interior system that is going to be very welcome, I think. As was noted by Leyland, that there is some changes coming to the interiors already in progress. For example, he pointed out Lorville 2.0 in order to have the cityscapes fit these larger interiors, as the buildings were too small originally designed in some cases. So I think this is a general positive. We've had a few different examples of technical ideas and concepts that were offered by CIG during different events, showing how players could be inside a building and watching their friend fly around, or players are inside a ship approaching a large city that's living and thriving and such. And this is one more example of how that layered effect can happen. I think there's a little too much emphasis on advanced player navigation methods. So basically, players can go up a ladder on a service line, or go through a normal elevator, or go up a simple staircase. I think there's a little too much of that. I think that's very mission focused. Most players are not going to need to go Splinter Cell in order to get to their habitation that they own or rent, or spawn at, in the early days. But I do see that the value in that for those other things and for some exploration needs. I hope that CIG does not get bogged down in those details, especially for what's going to be permanently player habitation and only player habitation / living spaces, commercial spaces that players can then use as services in those primary buildings. I've noticed that in many of the planetary landing locations, the habitations tend to be separated from NPC style structures or commercial style structures. It's nice to see a blending a bit more, where players do not seem like they're set away from the rest of the bustling city or the culture of those areas. And I wonder exactly how that's all going to kind of flesh together in different places. I mentioned that there is huge variety in every one of the locations, and that is going to be, I think, the challenge that CIG is going to have to rise to. I'm curious if the outpost styles are going to be kind of brought in and used as like a way to kind of maybe think about this. I think of the colonial outpost versus the outlaw outpost, for example. Or in broader terms, I think of Old Levski versus Grim Hex, and about how they were almost the same concept of having this freedom at any cost type attitude, where one was almost the good version and one was the bad or negative version, I guess you could call it. I'd be very curious to see some of the changes, and I hope they're not just at a shallow depth. I would also be interested in seeing some of the challenges of these buildings met in really exciting and new ways. A luxury structure with a massive aquarium like we see in the Million Mile High Club would be really interesting. Or maybe in the lobby have a laser light show or something else like that in a more trendy nightclub focused bustling capital city on Prime or something. I could see some really interesting dynamics, really emphasizing the new or the old, or even the clash of those two concepts in a place like in Lorville, where people from out of town, they need to be investing in these places, and they need the contractors from there but the Hurston Dynamics clings to the past with large golden structures to the family and naming the very moons of their planetary system after family members, and in gilded portraits in the CBD, the Central Business District. I'm very curious to see kind of those dynamics kind of all rolling together into these new structures, and I hope that some of that is really embraced based on the concepts. This is one of the first steps in this long process that are developing now, and by the way they're describing it, that these are being placed into a production pipeline, going beyond just concept art already as of publication of this video in early February of 2023. I would say that I see a bright future ahead, and I can't wait to see more. And as Jared stated, next month we should be able to see more about 4.0. I don't know if it's going to be about these structures, or more accurately, as he hinted, I think, a little bit there, about Pyro, which is a major part of the 4.0 patch, and its ruined station that's there. So I'd be very interested to see how the outpost and such, and the stations benefit from this advanced navigation. I think they're going to do better with the concept of ladders, elevators, chutes and ladders, sneaking through spaces for missions, outposts, and on a small scale and also on a large scale, stations are going to be very exciting places for that type of gameplay, especially in a lawless place like Pyro, or should I say as an alternate standard of living of Pyro, where the strongest are in charge. I'd be very interested to see those dynamics at play in a place like that, where there is genuine danger just by leaving your hab. So that's all my thoughts. I appreciate if you've stuck around this long. Once again, please subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you to my long-term subscribers. If you have ideas for other videos, please let me know. I am still busy in 3.18 PTU, and I went and visited the buggy track again a couple patches later, and those buggies still have extremely weak wheels, and they break off extremely easily, and they flip easy. So I have faith that they will change those buggies as necessary for this track to be a wonderful adventure to go on. To answer some of the questions I've had about the buggy track, one, no, so far I have not seen any way to race for UEC or earn UEC or have any type of that kind of thing. It's a shame, because it would be really neat. Two, there is no tracking right now of players racing. So even if you're just racing for fun, there is no way to track who's winning. And three, most likely you won't be able to get around the course in its current state due to what I just described, of other buggies flipping over and leaving broken tires everywhere, which are collidable objects when you try to drive past them. And also the general issue of trying to get back to where the buggies are to jump in another buggy to go. So my recommendation to you is wait a little bit for a couple more patches in the PTU cycle. And of course, when it goes to live, I'm sure this will be more polished. But just for now, if you do this minute, you want to jump in there with your friends, I'd recommend sticking to a small group, say 3 or 4 folks on a pretty strong server that seems to be pretty reliable, and then you have those extra buggies. So if one of you gets knocked out, or you Mario Karted into each other, and you can't flip the buggy that's been flipped, at least there's backup buggies to get back to, because I think there's 8 or 9 of them in the stalls. So just some thoughts. Wish you all a great night and fly safe.